Hello, everybody. And we are trying to do a transmission by simultaneous transmission by YouTube. So we're just waiting for the connection to start. So give us a couple of more minutes. Thank you. Hello, everybody. Um, this is so great to see you all. See such a huge audience with lots of friends, and also seeing so many amazing speakers. So this is going to be a great lineup. So I'm Emilia Reyes. I'm working in feminist organizations based in Mexico called Equidad de Género, Ciudadanía, Trabajo y Familia. And we're also one of the co-conveners of the Women's Working Group on Financing for Development. So, let me see. I think my video was off. So thank you so much for joining. And we are very thrilled to have you in this final event that feels like a party with also all of us, so many colleagues working together and working also in common struggles and also becoming like very close friends and family. So this is great. And I also wanted to thank my team in Equidad who've done an amazing work in making this happen. So thanks to Adriana, Ale, Cynthia, Gabriela, and Armando. And I just wanted to say that we are thrilled to having you here. We are waiting for a very exciting conversation. We are making room for both panel discussion, but also working groups and to hear from all of you, which is also a very valuable voice for us in the Women's Working Group. So without further ado, I want to open the floor and give it to my colleague Rosa. Thank you. Open your mic, Rosa. Rosa, we can't hear you.
Hi, colleagues. Welcome. Thank you so much. We're thrilled to have you here. As Emilia mentioned, I'm Rosa Lizardi, the Global Director of the Feminist Task Force and one of the co-conveners of the Women's Working Group on Financing for Development. I think what we are trying currently to ensure that we have a safe Zoom. So please bear with us, but pending that, I want to welcome you to this global town hall that we're having. We are thrilled to have all of you, all of our partners as part of this. This is a culmination of a 9-webinar series, Macro Solutions for Women, the People, and the Planet, which the Women's Working Group, together with many partners, have put forth to really look at the pressing issues and challenges under the rubric of a macroeconomic system and global governance system that is really underpinning women's inequality, the feminization of poverty, especially in this time of COVID, and undermining the well-being of women, their families, and their communities, the people on the planet. These issues need to be addressed in a comprehensive manner. We have been seeing from hosting these webinars, and we've delved into very many issues across the spectrum: health and care economy, financial markets and institutions, debt, tax, trade, intellectual property rights, financialization, the climate emergency, and the Green New Deal, and really how all of these impact women and girls and the burden falling disproportionately on their shoulders. So in these dialogues, we've really opened up spaces for connecting these conversations and underscoring the urgent call for action, and really the rejection of business as usual mode. And in this final session, we have a space for strategic evaluation and planning to go forward. Each and all of our areas have such great contributions to bring. So we want to maintain this space and move and be able to use it to go forward and go beyond, using the wealth of information that has been provided, such incredible insights from our partners, and we thank each and every one of them. One of you for participating today, and being part of this collaborative work. So without further delay, we want to go forward in our agenda, and we will be beginning with our first segment, which is looking at the state of play, an overview and recap of current challenges social movements are facing in the promotion of macro solutions. We're going to have an overall presentation of the state of play by our wonderful partner, Lidi Nagpil, who is the coordinator of the Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development, and also the co-coordinator of the Global Campaign to Demand Climate Justice. And we want to ensure Lidi is unmuted and showing video. So without further ado, thank you so much, partners, for being here. And Lidi, please take it away.
Lidi, please unmute.
Okay. At first, I wasn't allowed to unmute, so I was trying to unmute. Thanks. So it's quite a challenge to actually do a kind of state of play in such a short time. But first, I'd really like to extend my congratulations to the Women's Working Group on Financing for Development for a very successful run of the webinar series on macro solutions for women, people, and the planet. And also, I think I will echo many voices expressing deep appreciation for the able and dynamic leadership of Emilia and Rosa, and for the co-organizers, resource persons, and discussants. The range of topics and depth of discussions over the course of the 9 webinars very clearly expresses much of our hopes and dreams for financial and economic justice, not only at the global level, but what that looks like in our countries and regions as well. They point to the many challenges we face in different fronts, and I don't think I will do a good summary of all the action points and the recommendations that came out of the 9 webinars, but I'd really like to reiterate that we face many, many problems, such as the unsustainable and illegitimate debt, the unfair, unjust, and biased tax systems and illicit financial flows, unfair and inequitable trade systems and the intellectual property regime, the exploitation of labor and the unrecognized, unpaid care work that are mostly carried by women, corporate capture of our economies, the financialization and financial extractivism that is pervasive in the entire world, the impacts and implications of the era of data and digital technologies, and many others. So our exchanges and discussions have affirmed and deepened our agenda that is beyond specific changes around these issues, although we call for many, many different policy proposals and demands under these different issues. but it is an agenda that is beyond. It is an agenda of profound changes in the system towards that of a decolonial, feminist, equitable, just, rights-based system that is compatible with the safety, health, and limits of our planet. To realize our hopes and dreams, we are also rising to other challenges. First, while we have come a long way in articulating, promoting, and asserting feminist perspectives, there is obviously still so much work to do, even within movements for change and among our colleagues in these movements, for there to be a deep recognition, thorough understanding, and embracing of women's rights, of gender justice, and the agenda of overcoming patriarchy. Second, while women's movements have spread throughout the globe and have grown in strength, the task of transforming patriarchal capitalist system requires that we build our power and capacity to resist, challenge, and change the system to much greater heights and magnitude in our countries and globally. And that means growing in numbers, in leadership, in knowledge and skills, and building strong connections across movements and across struggles and across countries and regions. And we will need to do all of this in the face of the narrowing of democratic spaces and rising authoritarianism in many of our countries and in global arenas and spaces, the attacks against communities and people who dare defend their rights and voice dissent, and the escalation of gender-based violence, and all these amidst the multiple crises of the COVID-19 pandemic, the economic recession, and the climate emergency. There is no doubt in my mind that we will succeed, not only to achieve specific victories along the way, but to build a much, much better world. We have many stories, those of our own and of other women, of courage, of persistence, resilience and strength, and determination that inspire us and will keep us going until we achieve that better world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Liddy. That was amazing. And I think that was an awesome start for our conversation on our first panel. So I will invite our panelists to join us, our moderator, our dear Mariama Williams, who took the session by storm in the webinar in which she was there. So welcome, Mariama, and welcome our panelists, Corina and Crystal, Kate, Joan, Carling, and Patricia. Welcome, everybody.
So good morning. Yes, it is good morning for you all, and good afternoon to some people, and good evening to others. So welcome, everyone. I mean, this is a celebration, but it's also very serious. It's serious because it's our last event of the session and also ends in the year, a very tumultuous year. And so these have been 9 incredible sessions of dialogue and interchange of ideas. And I want to thank the organizers, again, Emilia and Rosa, and all of the team of the Women Working Group of Financing for Development for really conceptualizing and putting together and implementing this amazing series of events. We are gathered here together in this period of the 25th anniversary of Beijing, in the shadow of the 10-year anniversary of the Women's Bible, CEDAW. And also in the shadow of the financial crisis of 2008 that showed us many of the issues that have not gone away since then, but have just gotten worse, with the extreme obscene wealth accumulation by some individuals and corporations, and the increasing pauperization of many, most of them women and indigenous people. And also the rise in investor-state dispute that's robbing treasury and, of course, extractive industry and all the things that Lydia flagged. So I won't go over them anymore. I am really, really pleased that here we have 5 panelists who can really, 5 panelists, pardon me, can really speak to the event. And it's most my pleasure to moderate this panel and to ask each of them to present for maybe 3 or 4 minutes each, kind of their perspective and the directions that where we'd like to go and where we'd like to go, looking at the 3 questions of how can we break down the silos that we have between us in terms of organizing movements, and as well as across. Some of us work on climate, some of us work on trade, IISD, food, hunger, all of the various things that still plague us in the top of the 21st century. And some of the entry points that they can share with and dialogue about to promote macro solutions for women, which has been the focus of this, women, the people, and the planet. It's really tremendous that one of the group that has been most suffered from this macroeconomic policy, from capitalism, from encroachment and violence, has been the Indigenous people. So it's really most appropriate that we start this panel with Joan Carlin, who's an Indigenous activist, co-convener of the Indigenous Peoples Major Group for Sustainable Development, to really help to lead us off and help us to shape the direction of where we might want to pick up for the next couple of years as we look at this whole issue of macro solutions for women and the planet. So I'm going to ask Joan to please make your remarks, and then we'll move right along to the others. And then I'm hoping that we'll have 5 minutes max for each, so we could have a little dialogue between, and then maybe interact with the audience if possible. I see that, am I admitting people? So I will do that. All right, so Joan, please share with us, you've been part of this whole process. You've been organizing as an Indigenous people organizer, pushing sustainable development. And we know that the Indigenous people live their life from the perspective of sustainability, from the perspective of oneness with all of the universe. And we are now in this place where we are seeing, and in different cosmology of traditional people, that this is a year of reckoning. We're in a time of reckoning where prior to 4 things that were hidden or not wanting to be acknowledged is coming up, including the Black Lives Matter, the whole issue of people of color and colonization and what has happened, and how macroeconomic policy has been reinforcing those issues coming out of that era and continuing into this era. So please, if you'll take the floor and just talk with us for a few minutes.
Yeah, thanks, Mariana, and thanks for having me in this very exceptional platform for women. Yeah, I will be sharing from the perspective of Indigenous women, but more addressing the issue of how to overcome the silos, because that's I think is a critical issue that we also have to reflect upon. And from my perspective, it's really more how do we come together on common ground. And reflecting on the issues of Indigenous peoples and women and others, one of our common ground is non-discrimination, social equity, and celebrating diversity. And I want to emphasize the issue of celebrating diversity, because unless we also recognize that we have diversity, and be able to work together to uphold that diversity, we will always be thinking along the lines of our specific advocacy or specific agenda. So by recognizing and appreciating and working together in celebrating diversity and non-discrimination, we strengthen the position and solidarity and cooperation that we need to advance. And I'm saying this reflecting on Indigenous movements, because as mentioned earlier, there are challenges that we face, and there are also misunderstanding of the different social movements, right? Because sometimes we also get carried away by the agenda set by donors, which actually also is a factor in the creation of silos, and that we need to guard against those kind of attempts in bringing us together and building our solidarity while respecting also the diversity that exists within. So if I'm looking at the strategies also that we need to work on is also combining different complementary actions that we do at different levels. And it was mentioned a while ago, the need for us to build coalitions and multi-sectoral movements at different levels, and bringing to fore the different dimensions of the issues that we work with, but also being clear on our targets, the accountability, who is accountable, and that is where convergence happen, because we know who are accountable. It's all the states, it's all these ruling elites, it's all these corporations. So we need to put our energy on those common targets rather than getting sidelined, and strategize on what can be the key contribution of each social movement in putting pressure to all those that are causing social inequality and promoting patriarchy, and all the systemic barriers, right? So when we talk of systemic barriers, we also need to address those that are pushing for that status quo to exist. So from indigenous perspective, it's very clear for us that our enemies, if I may say, are the corporations and states that do not regard us as humans, that do not regard the dignity of other people, that do not respect diversity, that attempts to make us the enemy of other people. So they call us anti-development when we protect our land. And they create that narrative that we are anti-development. And when public receives that kind of narrative, it creates that problem for us. Then everybody will look at us as preventing their development, right? And that is the kind of I'm citing that is also the kind of narrative that the social movement should go against, because it's putting us in the how do you say, it's putting us not on the right path of being together, but creating the divisions among us. So I just want to mention that and to say that that one of the things that we also need to make sure is that we always put in the front and center and amplify the voices of the most marginalized, the most vulnerable, and the most that are experiencing all the kind of discrimination and violence against women. So thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Joan. And I think I really want to encourage that the challenge for many of us is to challenge indeed the narrative of development, because a narrative of development is part of the problem that we have. And that narrative of development is prescribed, reinforced by the macro solutions that are put forward. And the narrative of development is what's damaging the people and the planet. I want to take us now to Africa. And we know that Africa is now being the source of the extraction, the wealth and the richness of Africa. At the same time, the impoverishment of many people in Africa and the stimulation of conflict geared around extracting the resources. We just saw this week that Cyril Ramaphosa wrote in the Financial Times about the fact that African countries are going back into debt. They're in debt distress, serious debt distress, which will only be exacerbated by the response to COVID and the lack of response by the developed countries in terms of debt restructuring. And likewise in the WTO, we know that the developed countries, our same partners who sometimes talk about human rights and gender and so forth, are blocking the waiver for access to medicine and other kinds of things that would benefit all of our people, especially those in Africa and Asia. So I want to turn to Krista to talk about the macroeconomic dimension. So Krista Simoni is the director, NAWI, AfriFem Macroeconomic Collective. And I want you to weigh in on some of the issues. I know that Joan talked about the silo, and she talked about different ways that we could break the silo, mainly by emphasizing our commonality and the way that we are oppressed by the development narrative and the attempt to make Indigenous people and others who are the oppressed the enemy. For many of the common people who are suffering from poverty and impoverishment around the planet and in different countries. You see that in the US and others. So, Crystal, please.
Thanks, Mariama. And it's such a great pleasure to be here and such an honor to speak with such amazing, amazing speakers. It almost feels like I'm back at a CSW, sort of almost back to normal life, just on my screen. So I'll start off with a quote by Jessica Horn, which I really, really like. And she said this the other day. And she says, "There is no greater pleasure than creating in collaboration with sisters who hold a vision of our liberation so delicately but persistently in their hearts. I am of the collective, of the community. There is no me without a we." And it really speaks true to what I feel about all the people that are on this call and all the people that, you know, fight together in all these halls and rooms of power from New York to Addis. I salute you, I see you, I celebrate you, and I'm really glad to be part of this group. And I'll start off with the idea that all oppression is linked. And over the last 2 years, really, my greatest worry for my continent, but also across the world, is this increasing financialization of our lives. It's linked to everything. It's linked to our debt. It's linked to climate change. It's linked to tax justice in all facets of life, from healthcare to education. I see private sector taking back and taking slowly, you know, digging through a social contract between state and citizen and taking away that contract. And suddenly there's an increasing presence of private sector everywhere in the halls of the United Nations in New York, right down to the halls within our national governments, within the African Union, with our regional spaces. There's such an increase of private sector, and it's such an insidious way in which they've come into our lives. And it's getting harder and harder to imagine what we can realistically do to turn that back, especially now with COVID and a pandemic and such a pressure on our economies to provide for our citizens. Such a pressure when private sector is seen as the most efficient way of service delivery, but at the same time that also passes a narrative that our African states, for example, are incapable of providing for their citizens. And Mariam spoke about narratives, and narratives are central to the work that we all do. And when we open up who says what and what the words that we speak, the language that we use, what does it mean? And when we speak about women's empowerment, are we sure that we're all speaking the same thing? And does empowerment mean the same thing when the World Bank uses it or the IMF? And definitely they don't. When we do speak about austerity, for example, in countries in the global north, where there has been budgets that have been cut back, but when we come to countries, many of our countries on the continent that didn't really have a health budget to strip away, and so we begin to wonder if we're all speaking the same language and how we can open up and really dig down to what we mean as we speak. But I think really our hope lies in movement building and really going back to who we are and how we've always pushed back and this constant over bureaucratization of the work that we do. And Joan spoke about, donor priorities and donors sort of pushing us into an agenda that isn't all the time set by us, with measures of measuring our movements and our success that are not quite fit to the work that we do. And how do you measure movement building? How do you measure relationship building and the work that so many of us do to build relationships, to build friendships, to build solidarity across regions? And I think there's a way that we need to be pushing back on these narratives and these ways and frames in which we're forced into that keep us so busy doing that and writing proposals and writing frameworks and keeping us away from doing the very needed thought processing, dreaming, coming together and co-creating change and strategies that we so badly need for all our countries and regions. But I think lastly, because I don't have too much time and I'll probably come back later, is I think celebrating our wins because they're there. there's still such huge issues that we have to deal with. But making indents in the ways that the women's movement does, in very strong, very bold ways, that speaks to collective action, that speaks to solidarity in ways that not very many other movements know how. Reaching out to movements like the main FFD group or the climate change movement or the human rights movement, making sure that we're front and center in that is things that the women's movement has done and continues to do, with issues on macroeconomic policy that for so long we have been kept out of the loop, haven't been put at the center of these decision-making tables, even by the same people that are working towards progressive policy making and influencing. And I think it's time to take back the reins, because these are really issues about life. It's basically, at the end of the day, how fairly do our states collect money, and from whom, and how equitably that money is distributed. And those are not overly technical issues for the movement that we're part of, that we serve, that we continue to work with. So I'll stop there, and I'll probably come back a little bit later. I don't want to take too much time because we have such amazing speakers as well speaking after me. So thank you, Mariam. I'll hand back to you.
Thank you very much, Crystal. And I just want to pick up quickly on that you flagged the private sector, which is something that we haven't mentioned too much before, and that the private sector has been pushed everywhere into everything, and with this myth about their efficiency. And that efficiency of the market is built on women's labor, it's built on oppression of indigenous people, it's built on Black and women of color and people of color providing cheap labor globally as citizens and as immigrants. So we need to really work on that. The health budget of many countries don't exist, and the sector is decimated precisely because of structural adjustment policy in the 1980s and still ongoing. So we need to really push back at that narrative, and we need to be on guard, because this vaccine or not is going to be a strong push to say we need to catch up economic growth because of pandemic, and that means that we need to close our eyes to exploitation, to all of those things, that we need to rev up growth. And that's why it's very important, this meeting that we're having here, that we all start to build our narrative coexisting together, cohesively together, to be able to struggle against that. Climate justice being one of those really critical things that we'll hear about, and the financing of climate. So that's very important. I want to bring in Patricia Miranda, Advocacy and Coordinator of Latin American Network for Economic and Social Justice, LatinDad, and the chair of the Financial Transparency Coalition. And we know that finance is a big issue. Tax justice is finance. Climate justice is all about finance. Everything is about finance. Public providing health, providing the vaccine, which we have to be very careful about. It's going to be about the ability of developed and marginalized country to access that. So everything is about finance. So Patricia, please come in, please enlighten us as to what's going on and how you would see working against breaking down the silo and the entry point for a more comprehensive approach to promote macro solutions for women, the people, and the planet.
Thank you very much, Mariama, and like my colleagues, I am really thrilled to be with all of you. I want to feel that we are not only connected, but all together. And hopefully at some point next year, we will rejoin again. So I would like to start with saying what everyone knows, that the pandemic did not bring the crisis. It exacerbated the huge systemic failures that we already have. And it also exposed, and from what I clearly see in my region, but it happens all over the world, it's bringing more inequalities in labor, where the informal sector is overrepresented by women, less access to healthcare services, a highest burden of the care economy on women, without aid to really face this crisis, which is the biggest crisis ever. And all that over already existing problems that we as women have, like not having the guarantees to fulfill our economic and social and cultural rights, access to land, access to justice, access to a life free of violence. So these inequalities at this micro level are also part of the current decisions of how to finance and how to face this crisis from the global financial community. For instance, we can see a big inequality where we can see huge and multi-billionaire stimulus packages for developed countries compared with almost with very scarce and multiplied by 9 what we have for developed countries, what we see for developed countries, and what we actually have as rescue programs and packages for developing countries. And within those packages for developing countries, we also see that they are mainly addressing lowest income countries that really need right now aid, help, and financing. But middle income countries from not only Latin America, but from other regions are being left aside, not taking into account that there are other vulnerabilities that are not seen, and that poverty and inequalities are dramatically increasing in the last months. The projections for many developing countries say that the recovery from this crisis will be long and slow. And I am adding one more word to that, and it will be also painful. Given the inequalities that I briefly described, and of course there are more, it will be painful if there are the right measures, and especially a transformation of the current system does not take place. We have interconnections among the topics that we work on, and I congratulate the Women's Working Group on doing this the other way around. I remember I work on debt, especially on debt, you know that. And I remember how the Debt Relief Initiative, like 2 decades ago, gathered different stakeholders, different groups, different sectors towards one objective, which was debt relief. And now to have this initiative from the Women's Working Group with many feminists and with many progressive groups that are trying to do this linkage and to break the silos and to go with a message of transforming the system. I think this is a very important approach. I think it's a very good, it has showed with clarity what are the linkages, and I would like to bring some of them. We have heard the linkages between debt and gender, and how harmful are the conditionalities, or from the recent debts. We have already many examples: fiscal consolidation, austerity measures, the destiny of debt, which in many countries, as in my region, are basically oriented to infrastructure projects. So we've heard of that, but we know there are also important linkages that we need to talk about more and to share with more people. I think that for all the people that are in this group, these linkages are very clear, and now we need to be like to be a bigger umbrella and to deliver these to other people, to other stakeholders, to other groups, as the linkages between human rights and debt, the linkages between why still it has been impossible for the IFIs to have a debt sustainability assessment with a human rights approach, with an SDGs approach, to deliver the message that the current policies of financing the worst crisis ever are actually leaving many people behind. Also, the linkage between debt and the private finance, where big companies, multinational companies, and big banks, the financial sector, are increasing their corporate debt, and at some point they can also they might ask for rescue from the private sector. So what's going on there? In Latin America, the corporate debt is 2 years ago, it was almost reaching the public sector debt. and that is an important link if we talk also about a private sector that might not be paying their fair share of taxes. It's also important to link the current financing, that it's not really precisely aid or ODA. It's basically in forms of new loans and generating a new wave of debt. But what happens with concessional financing, not only ODA and to keep asking to developed countries to accomplish their commitments, but also on other concessional funds to face this crisis, as is the special drawing rights issuance, a new and ambitious issuance and allocation.
We still have 2 more panelists. Yeah, just take a couple more seconds to wrap up.
Thank you. And I would like to finish this with the link with debt and tax, and what we that's something that we are currently working on at LatinDebt, and how to link this among topics. And for instance, what we say is that debt cancellation is important now, and it will bring the water, because we cannot breathe now, and we can bring the water below our noses. But also we need a further debt relief and a debt restructuring, that it could bring the water down here to our necks. But it's not enough, because we still need to move, we still need to walk and to run. So we need to have an important tax reform, and we need to have to curb illicit financial flows. I think that could be an interesting way to link, to break silos, and also to deliver a message to a wider population in our countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Patricia. You brought to the table some new dimensions. You talk about a big umbrella that links ground debt sustainability into human rights, with SDG, looking at tax justice, looking at a whole range of things. And in that context, I wanted to flag that what we also need to be very concerned for developing countries who are indebted. This whole nature-based solution to climate and to indebtedness is also potentially going to be imposing again on ethnic minorities and indigenous people. So again, this whole idea of big umbrella that looks at debt restructuring, a systematic approach to it. And we do not want the 1990s, 1980s debt solution again. We never want to go back. We're going to probably have another lost generation because of COVID, but we don't want to put on it debt. And we have to really work really hard to not have a lost generation. We know the 1980s debt crisis caused a lost generation in Latin America and many other countries, and we do not want the COVID/debt crisis to also do that. So a lot of work for us to be organizing as women, look at cross-financing and tax justice. I want to bring in now perfectly for Kate. Kate Donald, Director of Program Center for Economic and Social Rights. And we know economic and social rights are at the forefront of all of this macro solution, that if we don't look at it, and that's one of the umbrella, one of the real founding architecture for this cross-sectoral linkage, intersectional linkage, is grounding in economic and social right. So Kate, please come in and share with us your perspective as how we do strong advocacy around macro solutions for women, linking together with economic and social rights, from where we are with social rights right now, and how do we use that in our framework. Thank you, Kate.
Sure, thanks, Mariama. And yeah, it's really echoing everyone else. It's really, really great to be here among such a wonderful group of people. So I haven't prepared a presentation because partly for principled reasons and partly for just reasons of time, but I thought so apologies if I'm a little bit rambling, but I'm basically thought it would be better to just kind of jump off and respond to what others have said. And there's so much to respond to and so much to build on from what the other speakers have already said. So I think, what we're really talking about is, how to build collective counterpower so that we can effectively counter the kind of very entrenched, very strong kind of elite and corporate capture of our economies and our governance institutions. And, that is no mean task. Obviously, that's a huge task. And, I think we shouldn't underestimate how difficult it is. And, we have I feel like we've been saying this for years and years, I mean, decades. Obviously, we need to build silos between movement. We need to bridge these silos between movements. We all need to come together. And, it hasn't happened to the extent that I think all of us would have wanted it to. And I think there's a number of the kind of political economy reasons for that we can't, dive into in too much detail now. I actually think the women's movement has been better at that than than many other movements, but still it is a big challenge. And I think that, part of what others have said has kind of, I think, highlighted for me that I think that there's a number of different strategies that we need to take. And I think kind of one of them is around this idea of like bridging frames. So by that, I mean the different languages that all of our different movements use, the concepts that we use, the normative frameworks, for example. I mean, coming from the human rights movement, we have this kind of very kind of set normative framework that we kind of cling to desperately. But, I'm very aware that it doesn't always translate to other movements and to other disciplines. And that so we really have to do the work of unpacking that and kind of building it together and building it out together and making it better understood. So kind of beyond that issue of kind of bridging frames, I think there's this the kind of necessity to really pool knowledge as well between us. So that, I mean, and I don't just mean knowledge like high level academic knowledge, although that can be important too. I mean, like really sharing experiences in a kind of interdisciplinary cross movement way, and like really centering the experience of the most marginalized as well. So I think that kind of knowledge sharing is really important, is a really key way that we kind of can bridge these silos. And then I think the third thing is kind of really consciously trying to enrich the strategies that we use. Because I think, our advocacy strategies aren't probably always, the most well-targeted or the most effective. And I think Joan was talking about this issue of like, identifying our audience and our advocacy targets. And I think we do need to be more strategic in that sometimes, and kind of, understanding better how change happens. And I think like narrative shift, and Crystal was talking a bit about this, I think really using narrative better and like understanding narrative shifting tools and like really trying to kind of hone our narrative is so crucial for that kind of strategic element. And I think in order to do all these things, we really need to kind of grapple with and understand better like the power dynamics within our movements, as Joan was saying. And I think funders is a really key element of that. We need to be kind of talking to funders and putting pressure on funders to better fund this kind of cross-movement collaboration and stop kind of fueling effectively kind of competition between us all. But also, like very frankly, the one kind of often problematic kind of power dynamic within our movements is the INGO aspect. And I work at an INGO, so I'm sometimes part of this problem. I'm sure. I mean, we try very hard not to be, but I do think we have to face up to the fact that sometimes INGOs, especially big INGOs, aren't helpful to this cross movement bridging and don't kind of bring in the voices of people from the national level and from the grassroots level in the way that they need to do. So I think we really, those of us that work within INGOs especially really need to grapple with that and try and do better. One final point that I wanted to bring in around this, one of the questions that was posed to us about the entry points for a comprehensive approach. I think one thing that is like really key is this thing that Joan was saying about like putting the most marginalized at the center. I really think that like has to be at the center of our narrative. We have to demolish this myth of kind of neutrality, essentially, of like, economic policy or economic systems ever being neutral. We absolutely have to demolish and take down that myth. And we instead have to really put forward this idea of like, if we center the most marginalized and the most oppressed people in our strategies and our policies, that will lift up everyone. It's the reverse of trickle-down economics, basically. And I think, there's lots of different interesting frameworks of this. One from the US perspective is this, that I really like, is this concept from Janelle Jones of Groundwork Collaborative of Black Women Best, which is this idea of like, we should be building economic policy in the US, like up from the perspective of like what would most uplift Black women in the US. And then that will like actually deal with some of the systemic and structural issues that our economic system is perpetuating. So yeah, I think that's really key, and I'll stop here for now. Really looking forward to the rest of the conversation.
All right, thank you very much, Kate. That was my clock for the 5 minutes. You were right in the 5 minutes. Gosh, you have really hit a number of things, but I think how to build collective counterpower is a very, very, very strong resonance. And how to, within that context, how to counter elite and corporate structure or capture of our governments and institutions. You flagged 3 different things that I really think that might form the basis of a bigger discussion: the different strategy and bridging frames. I like that. And those frames are around language, concept, normative framework, how that we need to unpack and make it translatable and build out and build in and try to move with each other in terms of understanding. The pooling of knowledge. Also, we have very vertical knowledge within each of our field and not much cross fertilization that needs to go, and enriching the strategy and better targeting, building again on what Joan has said and others in the discussion. But I think Joan started off with this whole idea of the development narrative, and you also picked up on it, narrative shifting tools. How do we do that best? And a thing that was flagged, I think, by Crystal about funders, the way that funders drive initiative and the way that the role of funders in keeping and maintaining the silos. And that's something that we need to guard against and fight against. And you've also flagged now a third element of that, which is the role of international government NGOs. So we need to problematize that a lot more. The question of leadership, it's not just about including participation, but having leadership by the most marginalized and by the people in developing countries, or even in the sectors of those who are in developed countries, that they need to be at the leadership. So it's not just consulting with them and participating, because sometimes we also need to watch our money flows, because as IGO, we take money, but that money actually should be building communities and community activism at the grassroots level. Many different ways, many different things. So thank you for really your frankness, your outrightness, and you're willing to really confront your own sectors. We need more of that. We need more of these kind of engagement. All right, so now we come to Karina. And Karina, wow, Dawn. Karina is executive committee member for Dawn, Karina Rodriguez. And Dawn has for a long time talked a lot about many of these issues in terms of globalization, in terms of the night watchman state, in terms of the social contract, the unraveling of the social contract, and that we need a new social contract. And so I would like you to come in and talk about gender justice as a framing and human rights and all of the macroeconomic things that Dawn has been reckoning with since the middle of the decade for women and other entities. Karina?
Thanks, Mariama, and hi everyone. So happy to be here. And I will follow up on what my colleagues already said. I think that to break silos, we need a comprehensive approach, and I think that a comprehensive approach is a feminist way to understand the world. I think feminists are doing comprehensive analysis and trying to produce collective strategies for a long time, and we need to strengthen that way. And from Dawn, we have been using for a long time this interlinkages approach to connect economic justice with gender justice and environmental justice. And I think this is a good platform for us to better understand the intersection between development strategies or development patterns, including production, consumption, financing, with the social organization of care, and with the social provisioning and the distribution dynamics. And I think there are the links that we need to still deepen a bit more. But I think feminist economics have provided us with extensive examples of this. For example, how sometimes women's disadvantages have fueled development strategies, how women's disadvantages have been understood as comparative advantages for countries to participate in the global economy. So I think we also need to go back to what we have already produced, and many of these linkages are already there. I fully agree with what my colleagues said about the need to challenge and reclaim and dispute the narratives. And I think something that I would like to add to this is that the mainstream narrative also built upon the idea that political issues are technical issues. They invisibilize the political dimension, for example, of debt, of taxation, So we need also to challenge this idea. Those issues that are shown as very technical, so people cannot enter the conversation because you need to be an expert, you need to have a very specific knowledge. We need to challenge this idea because those issues that are shown as technical ones are really the very key political issues that we need to face. And also this idea of the macro being the link from everyday life. And I think that feminism is very key to bring this together, how the economic policies really impact on everyday life of people. And I think this is the very basis where we can come together and also break silos in terms of strategies. And I think we already have examples of this, of how social movements from a wide variety are coming together to face these very interlinked macro issues. So I think what we need to do is to continue getting together. This idea of pooling knowledges and pooling experiences, I think is very key, and we have already some platforms that we can use. The campaign of campaigns that are going to be launched next week, the platform People Before Profit, the experience of the World Social Forum of Transformative Economies. I think they're all examples on how we are coming together, we are strategizing, and we are pooling knowledge and ideas. And I think the cross-cutting principles of human rights framework, gender equality, and environmental integrity should be the basis of everything that we do. And I think the other very relevant issue in order to build these collective strategies is to be able to really link the local, the national, and the global. These bridges are very relevant in order to really deepen this idea that whatever happens here has very much to do with people's everyday life. And I would like just to finish by saying that in terms of strategies, I think we need to prioritize. We cannot be everywhere every time. So I think part of our conversation has to do with which issues, which links do we need to prioritize and choose, the 3 or 4 issues that we feel are more relevant, or that we feel that we have more chance to advance, and then to decide with whom we can network, with whom we can build this collective counterpower, and where and how to advocate, where and how to make actions. I'm fully I really very much believe that collective strategies are the basis for this building of counterpower, and that it's only this counterpower built with global citizenship that will bring us to a transformation of this world that we really want to be better. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karina. You talk about a comprehensive approach is very much a feminist approach to understanding the world and to strategizing about affecting change. I think that's in the context of kind of rethinking development, rethinking the social narrative of what is development, who is it for, and how does it work. You also flagged the importance of grounding the foundations of what we want to ground thing, environmental integrity, human rights, but also the interlinkage, inextricable interlinkage, I think, between local, national, and global, that we cannot disarticulate them. And you talked about collective strategizing, and you flagged some of the issues that are already on the table where we can actually begin to build some of these, this linkage and this de-sialization, if you want to, campaign for campaign, People Before Profit, the World Social Forum, and the Transformative Economies. And we also have many different ways that people are transforming at the local level, right? And also academically, we have donut economics. We have a whole range of economic thinking by even academia, so that we have very good grounds for linking some of these struggles in terms of empirical, rational, analytical distinctions. I want to flag a few things from the chat in this session. I'm mindful that we're now 10:07 and we're now well 2 minutes into the next session, but we did start a little bit late. So if you have some patience with me, I want to flag that the diversity of which we speak, though we haven't explicitly named them, and the issue of people living with disability, and there's a thing that one of the thing that is missing from this panel and this presentation is that we don't have language, or we don't have a way to deal with some of, we don't even have sign language or anything to help and to name them as one of the groups that our particular attention need to be paid to in general throughout all the struggle, but most especially now with the COVID situation and what the social distancing and the people are locked in their homes and so forth all over the world. So I really want to flag, and I thank the person who flagged that, that disability include disabled women and where are they? I want to flag again a comment made by Bhumika, dear colleague Bhumika and Butch Montez, which I think is a great quote, which is from an Aboriginal woman, Layla Watson, that says, if you have come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you come because your liberation is bound up with mine, let's work together. And I think that, for me, that's the framework from which this meeting is operating and should operate. And I think we all can rally around that. And we need to give greater credence to that, especially when we start talking about local, national, and global linkage, because sometimes the global tend to be more oppressive and dominant over the local. And we need to really, really work and bring those together. That's what I'm going to wrap up. We have a lot of things to flag for this development narrative, shifting the frame, the role of the private sector, and another thing that wasn't so flagged here, the role of the macro and the development in terms of the violence against women and microaggression, which are emanating, yes, from patriarchy, but also exacerbated by macroeconomic solution and development policies. And of course, as people have said, exacerbated by the pandemic, and all the hidden vulnerabilities in our society, access to justice, access to help, and so forth. And then the big macro picture, we need to work at those, and we need to work at the big level of debt cancellation, debt restructuring, fixing the macro policy of the macro institutions of the corporations and the institutions and our governments, whomever they, wherever they may be, who promulgate injustice, even as they talk about human rights and other kinds of dimension. So I'll stop there, and I'll ask the organizers, are we taking questions, or are we shifting right into the other panel?
Thank you, Mariama. We're right on time, but I think we were late. If you want to take just one question from the chat, we are not opening the mics, but if you want to take one question, I think we can do that very quickly.
I see a lot of comments from the chat. I don't see a lot of questions. So if there was a question that I missed as I was just glancing through it, it's quite a lot. Please, how do you raise your hand again? I'm not even sure. I don't see many questions. I see a lot of comments. Good, thanks, wonderful presentation, excellent panel. Thanks for inspiring speeches. So if anybody's watching and see a question that I'm missing, please let's bring it up forward.
If not, I think then we can move to the next panel.
Yes. Thank you very much. And thank everyone. Thank you, Patricia, Corina, Crystal, Kate, and I know I'm forgetting someone, and Joan. Thank you all. It's been a really excellent panel. Thank you very much. And Kate, of course.
Thank you so much. And I just wanted to say how inspired I am. I mean, after hearing you all, it feels like, yes, we have a lot of tasks ahead in including not only in a narrative, but also in our practice, all of these work to link better our demands, our efforts, and I think also our failures. I'm gonna say we're losing on every ground because we are also very much isolated despite all of our efforts. So, and we see how powerful all of these demands are. So this is very crucial to address. I just wanted to highlight the format of this session, in which we're having speakers from previous webinars talking about macro demands and macro agendas. And I want to also thank people who mentioned here the Campaign of Campaigns, because that is really a very powerful effort that we are doing from the CSFFD group and the Women's Working Group on FFD. And on Monday, we will have an event where, of course, we want to have different voices, and we will also have the stakeholder group of people with disability there, along with many people. So this space was precisely to wrap up on a series of webinars addressing the macro demands, and this is the format. So we are very sorry not to have the financial means as well to make it more accessible, but we're working on that. And this is precisely part of the proposals that we're saying, how we can also pool more resources to work together, etc. So you will see that in the final breakout groups. But for the time being, I just want to say how inspired I am for listening to everybody. But without more further ado, I just want to give the floor to our next panel, which is also composed by an amazing and fierce group of people. So I'm going to welcome here Diana Yahaya, who's going to be the moderator of a very powerful group. So we have Chijo Kling, Miriam van der Stichel, Anita Gurumurthy, and Stefano Prato. So go ahead, Diana.
Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, or hello close to midnight, wherever folks are joining us from. I am so thrilled and so happy to be part of this conversation that we're having and listening to some of those really amazing, inspiring speakers that we had earlier on, and the amazing and inspiring speakers that we're about to have as well. So I think it's suffice to say that we can all agree that we live in such a unusual time. Maybe that's a bit of an understatement, but can't find any other ways to possibly describe that. And I think one of the things that have really come out very clearly is how much of this separation of public and private domain and spaces that has really put people in this time of pandemic, which is something that us as feminists is very familiar with and has spent decades working on and challenging and trying to break that. But it also, I think, translates into like the day-to-day that we go through as we work and as we think about how we're going to transform the system and change our world while, looking after our kids, making our food, coffee, breakfast, taking care of our elderlies and other members of our community. And so if you're just starting your day or you're in the middle of your day and things just got hectic or might just getting hectic a little bit more, you're finally at the end of your day. I just want us to take like a couple of maybe 5 deep breaths and just breathe in, breathe out. Sorry, we can't unmute folks' mic. Otherwise, I would invite everybody to just breathe in and breathe out into your microphone. So just 5 quick deep breaths. Okay, so hope that puts folks in a slightly different, calmer kind of space, because for this next panel that we're having right now, what we're gonna do is that we're gonna sit back and we're gonna have a conversation and a talk and a discussion amongst peers, among allies, among friends, among colleagues, into imagining and discussing the current state of our. I have my tea, I have my snacks, and so I invite everybody to just be as comfortable as well as we hear the next 4 amazing people who I admire so much. Some of them are friends, some of them are colleagues, some of them are people whose work I've been admiring and following for a really, really long time. So I'm excited to be having these conversations with them, and I hope all of you are as excited as well. And so without further ado, I'm gonna invite And as I mentioned, it's just going to be a really friendly, peer colleague talking and sharing, as well as reflecting. Our first colleague, Miriam, is the senior researcher from SOMO, which is the Center for Research on Multinational Corporations. I've been following the work that SOMO has been doing for a long time. And I recently was very, very privileged and lucky to have the opportunity to hear Miriam speak at one of the recent webinar that the Women's Working Group on FFD was organizing. And listening to her talking about some of the financialization and the financial extractivism. So it's a tough English word to pronounce, especially if you're a non-native English speaker. And it's actually even a tougher terminology, an entire domain of like financial and economic system and governance to understand, which Miriam was like so brilliant in like explaining and taking us through on that day. So Miriam, why don't you start us off, looking at the work that you've done in a lot of the financial sectors and the financialization and how that's really, really translating into the kind of extractivist that's really happening everywhere across the world, and how much more of that we've seen recently, especially in this year 2020, and what sort of lessons that we are taking for it in terms of like what it has shown us throughout this entire pandemic.
Okay, I can unmute. Hello, everybody. It's been really exciting to hear all these conversations, and it's like, wow, how to kind of build on it, because that's what we're trying to do collectively. And kind of one of the questions that we were having, like on how to start this conversation for this panel was like, why do we need democratic economic governance after the crisis? I would say the crisis is not over. We're really in the middle of it. And I was especially thinking about, the narrative that really needs to be changed. And I think if we understand what is happening now with COVID-19 and all these governments now having to pay for people who have no income anymore, I think we really have to call this like it's a big, big market failure. And it's really kind of bailing out the rich. And I don't like that word, but it's kind of what I think we have to understand is that these free market mechanisms, really have failed. And the problem that we are facing is that these free market mechanisms have been institutionalized in the free trade and investment agreements, in the IPR, in intellectual property rights, how it's being organized, even for the vaccines, that what we see, it's in the global governance, governmental bodies like the World Bank, IMF, etc. And at the same time, at the global level, we don't have the same kind of enforcement mechanism for human rights violations, for instance. So there's already in the global governance a big, big problem imbalance, and then, of course, a bias again for a market that is basically failing. And I think that's important that we have to think about it, that this is, the key message that we have to get across. And actually, the only one that I really heard saying this was like the new ECB female director or governor is Lagarde, saying, there is a market failure. So, there can be no market neutrality when one of the mechanisms of the ECB. So she was challenging that. And what we're seeing now, we have to understand what we're seeing now is kind of all these externalities that the corporations never want to take into account, lack of social security. That's why people don't have a means now to survive. So the lack of higher wages, not achieving the climate agreement and the SDGs, not taking women's roles into account, because we cannot survive as a society with it. That's all not taken into account. So I think it's important that we try and kind of get this message across, because I think, of course, there will be a reluctance to admit it. And surely that means we have to unravel so many kind of institutionalized mechanisms. And one of them, I think, is what you also could see if you say what needs to be democratized is kind of where is the money going? Yeah, because now there is free movement of capital. Governments are really, I heard the Indonesian central bank saying, I'm not going to impose capital controls, capital management and whatever. They're just afraid of the free market. And basically what you see also in the debt crisis is governments are not able to force where the money is going, who's investing in what, and to kind of get rid, for instance, and restructure and cancel the debt. You know, in G20, the whole battle is there. Well, the financial sector has to do it, but of course, it's not happening. It's governments who have to say that they have to do it. And I think what kind of what you really have to understand is that a lot of the profits from corporations are going to their shareholders, and their shareholders are pressing these corporations to do so that they have as much profit as possible. Yeah. So basically, if you will understand what is happening now with the COVID and all the debt that is being created, is because these shareholders got all the money, and there is no kind of government and mechanism to make sure that that money really goes back to society. And the worst, I would say, is that if you look at what is going to happen, the governments are going to issue debt. Who is going to buy it? It's again these rich people, and they will again get richer because they get input. So that's something I think we have to take into account. So that's one of the kind of the narrative I think that we have to get clear and to understand and to get out there. And then the other question was like, how do we shape the way how we think on what should be done? You know, as I said in my talk in the previous thing, we have to consider the financial sector as an extractive industry. And the same with corporations. As Crystal was saying, you know, it's private sector everywhere coming in, trying to kind of show how good they are. But don't forget, they want to get profits out. So whatever kind of they might give to the government, at the end of the day, the government, the civil society, the taxpayers have to pay more. And I think that's an extremely one. And that's why we have all these decades, I would say, where value from society, from workers, from women has been extracted. And we have to get rid of that thinking, oh, we need the financial sector and we need the private sector to help us. And no, they're not going to help us. They want to have just their financial value being extracted. So I think it's also important to see that basically what we see is a misallocation of the money. There's walls of money going into the stock market. Don't forget, the stock market has nothing to do with paying the corporations, because it's just kind of a casino where they are just investing. But it really isn't. Well, there's lots of money that is needed for society, and that's not where it is going. So what I think I also kind of wanted to say is it is really important that we also get women to help to change. I mean, let's say, put it differently. I've seen so many women really changing the thinking. You know, we have some very good women economists. I even think that, you know, kind of at the head of the World Bank, of the IMF and the ECB, I personally say it's little steps, but these women have been able. So we really have to think, and I didn't hear it in what before, is like, you know, do we really want to kind of take also political power? You know, kind of, I know one person who worked for the Greens, and she became a parliamentarian, first in the European Parliament and then in the UK. She's the only Green parliamentarian, but she's there. She's kind of really getting the Green message in the Parliament. So I think that's an important one. And then to finalize, I would say my power analysis, and that's where we have to build our counterbalance, is we have to be more refined in our power analysis. When I look at the corporate power and how to tackle corporate power, and also then their counterparts, you know, who are listening to them, it's like, you know, the corporates have economic power because they decide what to produce, how to produce, how much they pay their workers, etc. They have financial power by all these profits, but also because they are taxing, they're doing tax dodging. They have political power that relates to the lobbying. They have judicial power when we talk about ISDS, if they have the intellectual property rights. They have also what I call the battle of minds, you know, the advertisements trying to convince us that their way is the best way. And I think that would be an important aspect to try and kind of change the narrative and to build our counterpower. I think I will leave it there. Thank you. think Diana has problems
Diana.
to. Yeah, I think she's problem to unmute probably. Yeah, she cannot unmute. Yeah.
Yes. All right. Thank you so much, Miriam. I think the conversation around power is also something that I think that feminists has also been grappling for a while, because for a long time, obviously, the general idea about power has always been that it's power over and the way patriarchy is structured and everything else. And I think recently we had some really interesting conversation as well, because we've shifted from that into talking about power with, which is really the power of our collective, our solidarity, our movement. But then also kind of like maybe now we need to start thinking about just dismantling the whole idea of power as well. But then what would that look like, right? And then how would that translate into the macroeconomic systems and structures that we're all talking about here today? And I think I echo a lot of people, Miriam, like that your line on like 100% financial sector is an extractive industry, or large private sector is extractivist. Like there's no other way they can exist or operate as other than being entirely extractivist. And perhaps a lot of that has been, we know that a lot of that has been like obviously decades in the making. Like the current crisis that we are seeing right now didn't happen overnight. There were so many that kind of built onto it that took us to this particular moment of time and what we're living through here in 2020. And perhaps, who knows, many people are saying that the crisis that we're facing, both the economic and the health, could, or especially the economic ones, might actually stay with us for many years to come. And certainly the climate one will remain for many generations to come. And so I'm gonna then invite our next colleague, Stefano, who has been working and has dedicated a lot of his life to looking at the financing for development work. I actually first met Stefano at the Financing for Development meeting, and it was my first Financing for Development meeting. So it was obviously a very intimidating, scary process, but we have amazing colleagues, civil society, with the leadership of Stefano, really, trying to challenge the way our economic system was being made. And so I went from like, what is this entire thing that I don't understand, and how does this impact in my life, all the way in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, or in Thailand, into recognizing how powerful the system is and how important it is for us to transform it. So Stefano, if I could ask you to share with us, your reflection on how what we see right now that's happening in 2020, why democratic economic governance is important as we undergo this crisis and as we build a different world after we come out of this crisis, whenever that is.
Thanks so much, Diana, for this introduction, and many thanks to all of you for the impressive sequence of discussions. I could attend not all of them, but many, and they were really most inspiring. So I'll try to just ask three fundamental questions here. I mean, I think my colleagues and friends that have spoken before have clarified, the analysis, the violence of development, it's racial and gender and patriarchal underpinnings, and the extractive nature of the current hyper-globalization and the global division of labor that comes with it. The problem is that when we're talking about the democratizing global economic governance, the recent phase has clarified, in case we had any doubt, that we do need some global institutions, but at the same time that those global institutions, particularly economic institutions, are pretty much the ones that have shaped the current pattern of the globalization the way it currently is. So we find ourselves in a bit of a conundrum, because the very same that we would expect somehow to reform and to advance systemic reforms are the ones that have actually framed the current division of labor, and are in many respects captured by political economies and by the current political and economic elites. So how do we get out of this? So the first question is it worth the fight? Because a lot of groups at various levels, particularly if you get out a little bit of these little global economic freaks that, you know, we probably, many of us belong to, in which we're always there and follow the process. But many others have lost hope that these institutions can change in any significant manner. And they're just given up on them. You know, in our challenge to engage in FFD and other issues, the first obstacle we always meet is, please don't talk to me about getting anything done in the global that makes sense for what matters for people on the planet, because we do not trust this institution. We simply want to get away with them. Now, I believe I sympathize with these sentiments probably 600%, if possible. But the reality is that the moment in which we give away, we give up, we stop reclaiming and re-architecturing these institutions, our claim for a different reality, I think, would be further undermined. So, and this is a struggle we need to confront within our movements, how to convince somehow with solid arguments that we don't have to give up, that we need to engage in democratizing global institutions. I'm not sure I have a good answer. I'll be very honest. But I believe that we need to provide an answer to that question, because otherwise we remain a small group of, sometimes technical, sometimes political, but still insufficient to confront the struggle. The second challenge is, what is the turf that we elect for this struggle? Because what we're doing a lot, we're chasing a lot of meetings, we're chasing a lot of institution processes, we just running left and right, very often chasing calendars of events. My impression is that we need to have clarity where we want to rebuild some new institutions or possible reform existing ones. And I remain convinced that the United Nations is our turf for that. Rebalancing and shifting the barycenter away from Bretton Woods institutions and other institutions of economic governance into a more UN-centered process, for me, is the challenge. Now, this is because the normative foundations in the UN context are stronger, for our struggle, because the democratic character is more aligned with what we'd expect it to be, and because we have modalities of participation. Am I saying that the United Nations is some sort of heaven? No, it isn't. I mean, it's still a space which is heavily influenced by power asymmetries, and that has been increasingly corrupted by corporate capture. The most recent invention of this Food System Summit, which I have no time to elaborate here, is a perfect manifestation of the corporate capture shifting that the UN is confronted. But I think part of our reclaim needs to elect a turf, how challenging that could be. And I believe centering our reform, reclaiming, and re-architecturing agenda in the UN makes us stronger rather than weaker. Lastly, what are the elements of this agenda? Well, this is not the time. Many of you have mentioned a lot of things, but the only thing I want to say is that it's not a reformist agenda. And this means also that our technical propositions that sometimes change bits and pieces are not going to get us very far. It is a power struggle with significant power asymmetries, and this means that it requires a very strong social base, because power concedes only if there is that social confrontation. It will never be a technical request of a small group of light-minded institutions or organizations. It is a power struggle, and the systemic reform are going to reform and restructure the way in which power is administered, the way in which these institutions are governed. And therefore, our interlocutors, those in power now, will not be sympathetic to our quest. It is a power struggle, but we are not confronting it yet as a power struggle. We're still confronting it with the idea that, oh, maybe I have the best proposal, maybe let me prepare my technical brief, let me suggest how by changing this little, piece of the game, the whole thing will come back into motion. So I don't think we have yet organized. I liked very much some of what other speakers, including my good friend Kate, mentioned before. We need to win a lot of internal political economies within our movement to really build it up as a power struggle. And that's, I think, is still not happening. And if we really want to not only choose a turf, but convince others to join us, that's the kind of political agenda we need to build. Now, of course, you do, just to loop and conclude, you do understand the importance of that first question. How do we convince those that want to get away with it to rejoin? That's fundamental, because this is what is going to shift the power, the political positioning of our platform. Because right now, if we leave it to those that are there engaged, we leave it largely to the reformist, to the technical reformist. We need the political movements to walk in, to re-engage, to reclaim, and then to relocate, therefore, a proper balance between the political agenda and the elements of technical reforms. Thank you so much again for this invitation. These are just some small reflections, but I hope they could be helpful. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stefano. I think it's also really sort of like one of the things that I think in my previous job, when we as a grassroots movement, feminist movement, and then really also operating in regional and global spaces, what we often have in conversations with our grassroots members when we engage in these global processes and regional processes, who often really feel so different and disconnected from the realities of especially women from the global South, is simply that if it's not us, then who else? And if we don't set some of these rules in the way we want it and the way it would work for us, for women, for the people, for the planet, then it would inevitably be set by those who will not be setting it in our interests. And I think that's one of the thing that has really, I think, came up in midst this whole crisis, that is also a crisis that's affecting the entire multilateral system, the economic system, the health, and what that means for multilateralism, solidarity, both between states, but also most importantly between people's movement as well. And so I'm then just gonna take this straight to Yoklin, who unfortunately will have to leave us in a little bit because she has another teaching to go after this. Yoklin is from the Third World Network, and both she and I have done a lot of work around all kinds of terrible trade agreements you can think of here in this region. And she's done plenty of work as well at the WTO. I mean, there's so many terrible trade agreements in our region that I could take a whole night to list them all off. Yoklin, if you're with us, perhaps you just want to take us through, what were some of the lessons that you felt from this year, and what that means for us in terms of democratizing our economic governance, and then as well as how do we think we could actually do that? What are the steps and ways forward that we could potentially achieve that?
Thank you very much, Liana, and thanks again for the opportunity to be with this conversation. I was just thinking, where we are today, it's hard to believe it's 1 year, almost. COVID, as many people know, and we brought it up again this evening, is not over. I don't think there is a post-COVID. There's no such thing as post-COVID. This is going to go on for a long time. The news of a couple of vaccines being rolled out, the vaccines, the development themselves is so fraught with questions. I think is this a dysfunctional system that we're talking about? There's also the same system that is leading to the kind of vaccines and the process these vaccines are being created. So even as the UK has just approved for emergency use the first Pfizer vaccine, you have already so many, from scientists to, pharmaceutical companies themselves saying, is this vaccine safe? Are we rushing? What are we doing here? And even if the vaccine works, doesn't mean that it's a silver bullet. We will still have a systemic public health pandemic to deal with. So I would start off by saying we have to learn to live with COVID for a long time. The crisis that we look at in economics terms already was happening, the tensions of trade, all the pressure to continue liberalizing, trade agreements of WTO. These were already, being frayed before COVID. So it's not that COVID just triggered everything. It just escalated and exposed it, as we all know. Now, the financial instability that many of our colleagues have talked about, we are actually moving from all signs towards really a financial crisis. So for me, the challenge for us as civil society is really how are we going to grapple with all this in a world where in the new foreseeable future, we're going to be living under different degrees of lockdowns and movement restrictions. So organizing on the ground for even communities to be able to take their complaints physically from their village to the district office, to go, forget about going to courts, even to see a member of parliament in their local area. It would not be possible for the big chunk of the world. Governments themselves are being locked down and working from home or closing offices. So this is the reality that we will have to work in. What does that mean? At the same time, I'm sitting here and thinking, look at the WTO, it's very interesting, okay? A lot of groups had said, let's not engage, we want to close it down. You don't close any institution down overnight at any level. And I think that's something we all know. But yet today in the WTO, on the one hand, you have tremendous pressure to conclude this fishery subsidies agreement, which will have tremendous impact on small fisher folk around the world, especially in the South. Very little attention being paid, but there is a strong movement of our colleagues from the Pacific, from South Asia, across the South, with our friends in the North, fighting against this false notion of what subsidies are we talking about. And that's happening. At the same time, we have this amazing proposal that there should be a waiver of most of the substantial part of the TRIPS agreement on intellectual property, because for COVID-19 to be able to service the population of the world, to get the medical products, to get the vaccines if they exist, will need a suspension of intellectual property implementation. Did we ever think a year ago, 2 years ago, that we would be at this position? And that didn't happen overnight. It happened because of 20, 30 years of work from the ground to the global level of many of us here and beyond, fighting against an unfair intellectual property system, to the point that even governments and individuals in governments realize this system is unsustainable. So we also have this amazing process going on. Now, I heard today that there's been an informal meeting of a group of diplomats in Geneva between the developing countries and the developed countries, a core group of the people around the TRIPS debate, and there was a shouting match. All right. Now, this means that the macro tensions and the kind of power, struggle that we are talking about tonight is also happening within the circles of so-called government. Now, institutions in the end are ultimately about people. So we cannot give up, as Stefano said, any of the multilateral spaces that had its birth in democracy and human rights. We cannot give it up. At the same time, the other side, so-called, is not also sitting down. It is not accidental that Jeff Bezos of Amazon, Elon Musk, Gates Foundation have so much money. They are talking about billions of dollars to save the climate, to save health. The biggest funder of health, public health, global public health activities today is the Gates Foundation. There's something fundamentally wrong, because the failure of a proper tax system, the failure of governments because they were so lulled by either neoliberal promises or just pressure through IMF conditionalities, what have you. So the deregulation, at the same time, increase and escalation of the rights for corporations have created so much wealth in so few people, individuals, and they are bringing back all the money that they have spent decades not paying taxes for, exploiting, extracting, and now they're coming back to save the climate and to save people's health. Something very wrong. So this is all out there. And people are actually, even mainstream media is questioning some of these things. Should we have Gates Foundation save the world? Should we have Elon Musk save the world? And this is the turmoil within which we are working. So I would say, how do we coordinate ourselves? And it will be really difficult, because we are finding it very difficult in all our countries working on the ground. And yet today, across India, there are huge demonstrations of farmers against the new farm laws that the Modi government wants to try and push through. So people are fighting back. It is a big, powerful fight. So the questions are very big put to us tonight. I don't think we're going to have the answers, but we have battles everywhere. We are technically trying to fix things within a power structure of understanding where we are. Otherwise, the technical things we are doing will not make sense. So I think with all the bits and pieces, and the challenge is how do we pull it together? I think we need to find ways in the next 1 to 2 years to be able to work at the local level, continuously doing that. At the same time, virtual decision-making in the UN, in WTO, in the climate treaty, in the CBD, in the biodiversity treaty, they're all moving into very undemocratic decision-making processes. Even developing countries, the southern governments themselves are crying foul. So how do we build bridges, not just among ourselves in civil society, but build bridges with our parliamentarians, build bridges with the civil servants who are good, and if we live in hope, build bridges, the politicians will be a new generation of politicians. So I want to end by saying we have to have power relations, political economy, and politicization of youth. there are so many young people who are energetic and creative, and they're really showing themselves, in the past 5-10 years, and we need them together to fight with us. And the women's movement, feminist activists have always shown the way of how to be organized, to have systemic analysis, and that is something that is the biggest contribution. And I think that's a very good start for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yoklin, and thank you for joining us in case we don't get to say bye to you later when you leave us. But I think perhaps maybe they are also in many ways for me, even though I haven't really been doing the trade work anywhere near as long as Miriam or Yoklin has been, like some of the, the crisis that we can see with the WTO, I don't think it would reach the point where it is right now without all of the active organizing and mobilizing and work that activists from the Global South and the Global North had been doing around the trade multilateral system for basically like decades. I still get blown away when I meet activists who told me that they were at the first WTO meeting, and I was just like, wow, that's amazing. And that's just goes to show that, all this work that we do and usually transformative system change work that we are all aiming to do take a lot of time, and it's constantly evolving and it's constantly changing and it's constantly trying to respond to something that's new and emerging, which takes me to our next colleague, Anita, because she, I think, at IT for Change and her other colleagues at IT for Change are working in what I think is like the newest, furthermost frontier when you talk about democratic economic governance. You find a lot of the financial aspect and the macroeconomic policies of the past to be complicating, including like the trade issues. Then this new area of like digital internet governance and so forth is even like another whole, for me, even, as a fairly young urban middle class person, like to be such a completely new domain and new area. And Anita and her colleagues have been really trying to put out a lot of the stuff to really help a lot of activists and movements to really understand what we are facing is. And especially as we, we're all having this conversation on one of the many, many online tools that have just like proliferated since like the pandemic started. I remember telling, I think it might have been Yoklin, that I have never had to download so many tools, online softwares, paid for them during this last 6, 7, 8 months than I ever had in my entire life. Even tools and softwares that I never thought I actually wanted or needed or ever would think of or ever heard of. So it certainly is a new area, it's new and it's challenging, and in light of what we are going through as well here in 2020. So Anita, if you would just take us through what do you feel is the lesson that has really emerged throughout this year, especially with regards to democratic economic governance and our ways going forward?
Thank you so much. It's very hard after Yoklin speaks to come back and say anything meaningful. This forum has been very, very enriching. I have also attended a few like Stefano. And I think that it's an honor to be part of this rounding off exercise. I don't know whether in the month of December I have to be grateful or I should feel authentic in my confusions. It's been a very surreal time, and what has actually kept me through these months is only my political friendships. And I think that's something I'd really like to foreground, to say thank you to all of you. Thank you to many of you who may not even be friends, but it's my political friendships that's really allowed me to keep my sanity through these months. So to get into a more critical analysis framework, should I take a deep breath, Diana? What is really, from the point of view of the digital economy, the democratic governance agenda, the deficit and the crisis that confronts us in the digital domain? Of course, all of us don't need an introduction to big tech, and the legal scholar Frank Pasquale uses a concept called functional sovereignty. And he says, look, if there is a private firm that acquires the power to control the market and becomes the force that shapes and organizes the market as a whole, then it has arrogated to itself functional sovereignty in the economy. So if you take this and apply it to big tech, it will really fit very neatly like a glove. And we have seen that in this moment, and as Yokling cautioned us to not be misled into believing that there indeed will be a post-COVID time. We are in COVID, post-COVID, in a perennial kind of a movement. Disaster capitalism has really emboldened the digital sector like never before. So you already had a kind of a huge democratic governance in the de facto power and functional sovereignty, control over all our infrastructures that the digital had. And now you're moving towards an era where they have really, it's like they've had a shot, you know. So in this moment, particularly in the Indian context, we have seen e-commerce transforming supply chains. And between the month of March and April, you could actually see that e-tail businesses registered a 45 to 50% growth in overall gross merchandise. So that's very huge. And during the lockdown, you saw that there were like these companies going mad on acquisition sprees and on also diversification, both vertical and horizontal markets. So we had Alibaba backed Big Basket take over Grofers, and then we had there was this dairy farmers thing, with very small producers called Daily Ninja, which used to supply milk. And so Big Basket took over Daily Ninja. So you actually had these series of acquisitions. And of course, like Miriam has pointed out, there is this webbed network of connections, right? Who's acquiring whom. And finally, what you see in the graph is that in the past few years, the number of big tech firms has more or less stayed static. And that's because the bigger tech firms are buying up the startups, or they are actually getting into mergers or acquisitions. So this is really completely untenable. What Miriam was talking about is a complete market failure, and we are trying to use old competition law, mergers, dealing with the rule book, which is completely inept in dealing with all of these things. In fact, the end game of all of these acquisitions and the ways by which they really use their data to get to the consumer and get to the granular details of how the logistics chain is operating is hollowing out local business, hollowing out the local economy. It is completely hollowing out local skills, which are vital for regenerative production at the local level. So, I mean, this is really not only about Jeff Bezos. I think we need to understand that for the future, we are going to see big tech, big pharma, big agriculture, all of them in a kind of, one of these parties, and they're all going to be wearing various costumes, but blending data with their primary business. So this is really going to be the future. And I think I might be sounding extremely pessimistic, but that's the scene. It's a really, really tall order for movements to reorganize. And as we speak, data regulation is, as feminists would say, it's a problem without a name, right? And it's a problem that nobody knows how to regulate data, and everybody accepts that data is enclosed by private firms. So it's a very happy situation of default proprietary ownership by big tech firms of data, which of course is a cross-border commodity, as a cross-border resource, does not have really a governance regime. But we are told that the contribution of cross-border data flows is actually carving out a bigger share to global GDP than manufactured goods. And that's the official statistics of UNCTAD in 2020. So what are you actually going to do about this situation? We really have had some tinkering through tax proposals. Of course, none of that is useful. And Diana mentioned the free trade agreements. In fact, the most latest free trade agreements with the EU are so dangerous because any sector that you're using digital services, healthcare, finance, agriculture, transportation, If you have an FTA with EU, the data in those sectors will flow back to the EU. And all of this is happening in a level playing field where data can freely flow backwards and forwards. But we know that it flows only in one direction. So what does this really mean in terms of a New Deal and how does it affect women? So I'll just take half a minute and to say that this particular crisis actually was not like the previous global crisis in terms of its employment impact. I think that's a very important thing that macroeconomists, feminists have been telling us. The impact on women's employment in this instance is very, very different. Most developing countries have closed their borders, and so tourism, recreational services where women dominate, you really actually see that they're all pushed to the informal sector. So we are seeing a process of multiple peripheralizations. How and why? You're seeing that a shift to online services with opportunities for women implies that many women in the margins of the economy have lost out. And some women will be displaced by other women because there are some opportunities for online micro work, which is completely not organized. You don't even see those women, right? Women who are working for these companies through the night, doing work on laptops, you know, they are not even counted in the economy. So they are disciplined by the algorithms and disciplined by the digital infrastructures of Amazon, Mechanical Turk. And so what you actually see is a peripheralization of these women and of countries that are not integrated into the high-end digital value chain. So to conclude my analysis, I'd like to say that you have this very heightened, you know, celebration of why e-commerce is a success story for women. And we need to really unpack this, unravel this, and understand what has been repeatedly iterated in this webinar as the systemic analysis needed to understand why the digital economy is extremely unjust. And I think we really need a lot more creative thinking and grassroots organizing, demystification, pedagogies, and cross-movement analysis. And that's something perhaps we can talk a little bit more in our next round. Thank you very much.
Diana, you need to unmute.
Sorry. Okay. So I think it's just like really sad when we're having this really wonderful, powerful, interesting conversation and discussion. We never have enough time to have these conversations, you know, in more detail. But I am so grateful to our colleagues today who really, I think, set the tone in terms of where could we potentially go from here. And I know we're going to go into the working group later where hopefully we'll have more opportunity to discuss that some more. I think I'm just going to, I mean, I don't think I could close any more than how all our amazing speakers have already done so far. I think it's just really kind of echoing because we covered so much today. We've heard a lot of folks speak about trade, about financing, about digital, you know, internet governance, about e-commerce, about the UN, about the WTO, and tons of other spaces. And I think the thing that really comes out of all these conversations I'm hearing from folks is the systemic and structural changes. And that's the only way we can get to a different sort of world, you know, that's gender just and equal for everyone after this pandemic and throughout this pandemic as well. And I hope you all was excited and inspired as I was. I know I am, and my adrenaline is all rushing now. So even though it's midnight, I'll probably join the breakout group later because I'm just like too blown away and therefore too awake, and so definitely not going to sleep anytime soon. And so thank you once again, and I want all of you to thank our four amazing colleagues Yokeling has left us for joining us and sharing with us their knowledge and experience. And I am going to hand this over to our organizers.
Thank you so much, Diana, and thank you, Miriam, Yokeling, Anita, and Stefano for this wonderful second dialogue. A lot of food for thought. We will have time for those of us on Zoom to further discuss some of these points. So first of all, what I want to do is move us into segment 3, and I want to close this part that is on YouTube Live. So if you want to see some of these presentations at a later time, they will be on our YouTube channel, the Women's Working Group on Financing for Development. So at this point, I'm just going to take a moment to close officially the first two segments. Stay with us, those that are on Zoom, because we're going to have a time to discuss. Thank you on behalf of the Women's Working Group for those who have joined us on YouTube Live. Please view some of the other webinars on our YouTube channel, and there is a link if you would like to join our general mailing list in the chat for the YouTube. So thank you so much for that. Okay, so